Hey friends, welcome to episode 512 of the My 123 Cents podcast. Joining me this week is Chad Smart. And Chad, how are things going? We recorded, even though we had a new episode that dropped last week, our tribute to Sid Vicious, we recorded almost 2 weeks ago. So it feels like forever since I've done a podcast. I've been on vacation, out of the country, uh, you know, doing all kinds of fun things. But how are things going for you?
I'm like I said, as I told you right before we went on the air or started recording, it is like the surface of the sun right now in California,
Mm.
and so I'm just trying to stay cool. It's one of those times where you sit right in front of the fan and you still sweat. So
Wow.
that's been fun, and it's supposed to be this way for a few more days. So hopefully, I don't get heat stroke. If I pass out during this show, you'll understand why. I was upset when I was getting ready to record and, went and put a shirt on because I figured I didn't want to scare off all of our watchers on YouTube by not wearing a shirt. But I was like, man, I should have wore the Acclaim shirt when we talked about Sid a couple weeks ago.
Read my shirt. It's Gorilla Monsoon, and he's saying, "Will you stop?" So,
But no, it's all going good. Otherwise, yeah.
yeah, we're gonna get to our topic in just a few minutes. But since you brought up the Acclaimed, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on All Out, the pay-per-view that AEW presented. Just what about a week and a half, 2 weeks after All In out of Wembley?
Yeah, about almost 2 weeks, which thankfully they did put an extra week buffer in there this year, unlike last year where it was 1 week after. So they did actually get to build the show a little bit better
Uh-huh.
than last year. And speaking of the Acclaim, the Acclaim was on the pre-show, which I have not watched yet. And the pre-show did not give me a lot of hope uh, for the main show because I don't think there's anything on the pre-show that needs to be seen based on the matches that are there.
Yeah.
And that's a whole nother conversation we can talk about in future episodes about booking. And, when you put guys that are on TV regularly against guys that show up once every 6 months, doesn't really make for the most compelling matchups.
Mm-hmm.
But the show itself was, again, when it comes to actual pay-per-view, AEW, I don't think has had what I would call a bad show in their history. The end of last year was a little lackluster, maybe the last two pay-per-views of the year, but this one was, an all-time. I mean, I probably won their top five. I need to go back and rewatch the main event because it was the Hangman Page Swerve Strickland unsanctioned cage match, and
Oh, they closed
that
with that.
yes, and
Okay.
last November I was at Full Gear, which saw Page and Strickland in a Texas Death Match, I believe it was, which was one of the most violent matches I've ever seen live. And I don't know if I just wasn't paying attention that closely during the cage match, but I didn't think it lived up to the violence of the previous matches until the very end. And what I was just reading online before got on here with you is that people were saying how violent it was and how it kind of maybe went too far. And so I'm like, oh, maybe. I mean, there were a couple cinder block spots, a power bomb onto a cinder block, which I'm sure, and the cinder block did not break easily. So I have a feeling it was a legit cinder block.
Yeah.
And then it ended with a hypodermic needle being shoved through Swerve's cheek. So that was a little maybe too indie-rific for the show, but I think the bigger show was the biggest event shocker really was the BCC turning on Daniel Bryan and pulling a Terry Funk move and putting a plastic bag over Bryan's head. So
I saw that. I saw the comments before I saw what happened, and I saw them say something about Terry Funk did it to Ric Flair, and I was trying to think, okay, well, what happened? And then I saw the clip this morning, and I know WCW back in the day, that would have been 1989, I believe. So 35 years ago, when they did it on TBS, they got some heat for. I think that happened on TBS.
Yeah, it was at the end of Clash of Champions.
Yeah, they got some heat for that because it was on regular TV. Now, this being on pay-per-view, and you were talking about violence, so let me ask you about that. Does being on pay-per-view make it different? Does it, in your opinion, allow for a little more latitude when it comes to violence or language or things? Because I think AEW has never intended to present itself as a kid show, if you will, or target families per se. It's
Mhm.
more of the what I envision as the 20, 30 something wrestling fan, and not necessarily father, son, mother,
Mhm.
daughters going to see a wrestling event. So what are your thoughts?
No, I agree that when you're on pay-per-view, I think you have a little more leeway because people are actually paying to see the show, as
Yeah.
opposed to if it's on broadcast TV or cable television. You could just be flipping through the channels and stumble upon it and decide like, oh, what is this, and not know what you're getting into.
Hmm.
If you're not familiar. And I agree also that, and I think this is one of the things that is good about AEW and is also probably one of their detriments as well, is that they are not necessarily gearing themselves towards families, and they're not trying to be WWE.
Yeah.
WWE has been catering to kids ever since Paul Hogan.
Right.
And whether or not they, I think during the Attitude Era, they tried to distance themselves from that, even though they were still obviously, very much into the kid audience at the time. I mean, I think, how many kids in school got suspensions or
Yeah.
detentions for crotch chopping down the hallway.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think AEW is more for the indie wrestling fan, or I can just say the wrestling fan. And there's a term that has started popping up. I saw several signs during All Out that said sickos, or for the sickos. And that's we've discussed it here, I think a few episodes back, about how wrestling itself isn't a draw in the mainstream. And
Mhm.
so by AEW being more of a wrestling promotion than a sports entertainment promotion, it is for the hardcore fans who I think are more receptive, as we've seen. If you look at the indie scene and a lot of stuff that goes on there, which you and I've talked about off the podcast before, about sometimes it does go too far in the violence and the death
Mhm.
matches per se. And so hopefully AEW isn't going down that road too far. But when you have a feud like Hangman and Swerve, which is based purely on, I mean, Hangman burnt down Swerve's childhood home last week. That's, not going to be, you're not going to go in and trade holds and counter holds.
Right.
And to that regard, the opening match was MJF versus Danny Garcia. And this is a match that has been built up over the last 2.5 months, with MJF trying to injure Danny Garcia, you know, uh, almost broke his neck, busted a champagne bottle over his head. And I was impressed that at the start of the match, Danny Garcia just came out and started, attack. He didn't even wait for the intro. They just went into a heated match.
Hmm.
Whereas, one of my complaints from WWE over the last month is, we've been building up CM Punk and Drew McIntyre's hatred for the last 6, 7, 8 months, however long it's been since the Rumble, and they just have a wrestling match. And it's like, but if you guys hate each other so much, why are you trading holds? Why are you, doing a standard match? There needs to be that emotion.
Well, why wasn't Paige arrested for burning down
It's a good question.
Sturf Strickland's home? That's arson, brother.
That is arson. It's on camera. Why did why wasn't the cameraman arrested for accessory to arson? It's one of those things where trying to put logic into an
Oh yeah,
illogical situation. I mean, but
exactly.
I thought the same way. Yeah, it's like this isn't. I mean, I don't think Swerve and Page signed any type of uh, disclaimer, or not disclaimers, but sheets that absolve AEW from whatever legal precedents. But yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's time. Hopefully, on Dynamite, Swerve shows up with Clarence Mason, and they
There you
can
go.
get this taken
There
care
you
of.
go.
Yeah.
Well, we spoke of indie wrestling briefly, or the topic of indie wrestling, and I
Mm.
do want to mention details are still coming in, but Stride Pro Wrestling is making its return. One night only coming up. I think it's one night only at least on November the 8th. It is a Friday night in Creel Springs, Illinois, at the high school, or I'm sorry, in Crab Orchard. Good Lord. It's in
Mhm.
Crab Orchard at the high school in at Crab Orchard High School. That's where Tyler Heath Hatton is the athletic director. It's a fundraiser for the school. So it's going to be a fun night of pro wrestling action, and I will be there on the
Are you
microphone.
putting
And
the spandex back on?
no, I am not wrestling. I am just doing ring announcing, which is an area where I am most comfortable. Obviously, people who have seen me in the ring and wrestle
Mhm.
know that that is not always a pretty sight to see, but it is coming up again, and Tyler will be on the show at some point to talk more about it and release more details. But I know he had contacted me uh, before I left for vacation and had mentioned doing a show and asked, said that it would be either in November or in March of 2025. And so he picked November 8th. Doors open at 6. Bell time is at 7. Again, it's at Crab Orchard High School. I don't know why I always think Creel Springs, but anyway, it is at Crab Orchard High School. Tickets just $10. So we will have more details. We've still got about 2 months before that event, but stick around, stay tuned for that. And as I mentioned, I've been on vacation. We went to Alaska, never been there. We were on a cruise, and every night they do comedy. Chad, have you been on a cruise before?
I have not.
So they do different, we had different ports of call in Alaska, 3 or 4 stops in Alaska, and then a stop in Canada on our last night. But during, the cruise, while you're out to sea, for entertainment, they do trivia contest. I actually won the 80s sitcom trivia, so I think you'd be proud
Nice.
of me for that.
Now, were you in international waters?
Yes, at some points we were,
Did they
yes.
have cockfighting?
No,
Oh.
no cockfighting, and limited cocktails in some of those areas. But uh, part of the show or part of the cruise also includes comedy. And so we would go every night, and they'd bring in different comedians, but the same comedians that were on the boat would also vary up their act and do a PG show and do an adult show and whatnot. So we saw multiple comedians, the same comedian multiple times. So the one guy who, in my opinion, was the best, basically he would pull audience members into his act, and then he based his whole 30-minute routine around people in the audience. And we sat in the front row that first night, and I'm wearing these socks, and for some reason he gets a glimpse of partial a sock showing this for those who are
For the
listening.
person, okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say, for the people listening, it is a Ric Flair sock. It's not from my Odd Socks. I forget what company this is from, but anyway,
Stance,
it might be Stance. So
not a sponsor.
not a sponsor. But anyway, I'm wearing these socks, and he stops his act and he goes, "What is on your sock?" And so I'll pull up my pant leg and show, and he goes, "Is that Ric Flair?" And I say, "Yeah." And somebody in the back does the woo right on cue. So then I ended up becoming the butt of the joke for multiple minutes, asking about the other socks I wear, how old I am, yada yada yada. So anyway, uh, I just thought it was kind of cool. One, that when he said, "Is that one?" that he recognized that it was Ric Flair, and two, that somebody in the audience also knew to do the woo. So
And
uh,
three, that turned out to be Ric Flair in the audience.
yeah, exactly. But it's kind of funny because and that's actually where I got the idea for this week's topic about talking about commentary is from one of the many Conrad Thompson podcasts. But Conrad was talking about Ric Flair the other day in reference of him being kind of a pop culture, kind of has transcended just the basics of wrestling. And that's kind of, maybe a conversation for down the road too with AEW and WWE and those kind of celebrity or crossover appeals. But I never really thought much of Ric Flair being a crossover star because he's not been in any movies, but he is really iconic in the woo and the Rolex wearing, kiss stealing, wheeling dealing son of a gun. So what are your thoughts on when you hear Ric Flair? I mean, do you think of him as someone, he's obviously not a Rock or a John Cena or even a Hulk Hogan, but I do think there are people who don't necessarily watch wrestling that know who Ric Flair is.
Yeah, and over the last, I don't know, decade, 2 decades, Rick has shown up at sporting events.
Uh-huh.
I know some teams, and I wish I could tell you which one. I think the Carolina Avalanche
Yeah.
would woo, like if somebody scored, or during the game they would put up Flair on the jumbotron doing the woo, and then the fans would follow. I think college football has done the same thing. There's a few rap videos that I believe Rick is in, because his lifestyle that he portrays, and
Yeah.
sometimes maybe too much of the realistic lifestyle, is you know um, uh, epitomized, is that the right word, in rap music and the rap culture.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I don't think he is as mainstream, like you said, as Hogan, Rock, Cena, but I definitely think that he is known in circles outside of pro wrestling, and
Yeah.
not just in lawsuits circles.
Right. 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 Well, and I know, and I can't remember the team name, but there was, I think, a minor league baseball team
Mm-hmm.
that had incorporated elements of Ric Flair. I think they even called themselves the Woo, and Flair issued a cease and desist, and so they changed their logo because I think the mascot even had like sunglasses and a robe and looked very much like Ric Flair, and they have altered obviously in the wake of that cease and desist. So yeah,
They should
uh,
have went with Ricotta Flair.
there you go. There you go. That's how you get around those kinds of things. Ricotta Flair, of course. Wrestling Pro Wrestling, are they doing anything out there in Burbank?
No, I've not, since the show you and I went to. I think they had one show booked, but I never heard if they ever did it.
Mm.
And,
Yeah, I was actually looking at some old pictures the other day on because when you're on a cruise ship and you don't have Wi-Fi, back in the day we would read cereal boxes or read the aerosol can in the bathroom. But on the cruise ship, I went through my old pictures and was reminiscing and living vicariously through old moments, and those moments from Wrestling Pro Wrestling popped up. But the topic at hand this week is wrestling commentators, commentary teams, if you will. I had put this out on Facebook kind of late on Saturday after we decided and drilled down on a topic. And really, the genesis of this was the announcement and the debut, I guess, of Joe Testator on WWE Raw this past week on the Labor Day edition of Raw. Kind of a new era for WWE in many ways. Obviously, Vince McMahon is gone, and we will be talking more about the Vince McMahon docuseries that Netflix is going to be producing or has produced and is going to be presenting later this month. We'll do some reaction shows to that, but there's new leadership, there's a new look. There's the last SmackDown on Fox aired this past week. It's moving to USA, I believe, and then Netflix deal goes into effect in January for Raw. NXT is going to the CW. So lots of moving parts going on right now with WWE, and lots of changes. And I guess it makes sense to kind of shake things up with the commentary team and bring in new blood and whatnot. The original intent was for people to throw out commentary teams, and then Chad and I would pick our favorites. A lot of people just kind of took it to heart and put out their favorites and didn't really have any things for us to choose. But Chad, I guess before we get too deep into the Joe Testator and the changes going on there, traditionally speaking in wrestling, color commentary man and play-by-play man, and I'm saying man because traditionally speaking, again, it's been a male-dominated part of the sport. We've seen female referees integrated in, we've seen female ring announcers, uh, obviously female wrestlers and managers, valets, whatnot. But really, besides Renee Young in WWE, we've not really seen a woman on the broadcast team for any company, other than some guest spots from time to time, and it's usually a female wrestler or celebrity. But uh, so I don't know where I'm going with that. But anyway, what what do you think makes a good wrestling commentator? Because we've seen guys who have been able to talk, do promos and whatnot, who have transitioned or tried to transition into becoming a commentator or a play-by-play guy, and it just hasn't worked out. So what
Yep.
elements do you think are necessary? Because with Joe Testator, Pat McAfee, two guys that were wrestling fans or are wrestling fans who have transitioned over to the broadcast team, didn't have that experience. So are we seeing a new standard being set in wrestling commentary?
Possibly. And real quick, to the point of female commentators, I know Veda Scott,
Yeah.
something like that, does a lot of commentary on the indie scenes.
Okay.
But I think we can trace the lack of female announcers all the way back to WrestleMania 2. I think Susan St. James set the bar for
Yeah.
what women's commentators are, what probably promoters are afraid of women commentators being. And anyway, with that, what makes a commentator? I think part of it is knowledge, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And to show that I'm not a complete misogynist, we can go back to, was it SummerSlam 93, 94, when I want to say Art Bell, and I know that's not the guy's name, but the ex-football player was the new commentator, and he just been like, how much this guy weigh? How much this guy weigh?
That was Art Donovan.
Art
It was
Donovan.
King of the Ring 93, I
Okay.
think.
I got Art right. But, obviously it was somebody who wasn't familiar with
Right.
WWF. And
Yeah.
so, I think Pat McAfee coming in, and I don't know what his comment, I didn't know who he was before he joined the WWE broadcast team. I have since learned that he was a kicker for the Indianapolis Colts,
Mm-hmm.
and he has a radio show. And that's still all I know, but I think he at least knew the product. And I'm going to go off on several tangents here. So I'm going to ask you real quick.
Yeah.
Part of the changes that are going on right now is because Pat McAfee is doing college football.
Yeah.
And then he'll be back in January when Raw moves to Netflix. It'll be him and Michael Cole moving back to Raw.
Oh, is that the plan? I didn't
I
realize
believe that's the plan. Yeah.
Okay.
And so my question to you would be, are these changes that are seemingly short-term changes,
Uh-huh.
are they good for the product, or is it more of a going to be, not confusing, but lack of consistency, I guess?
It's a good point. And in my initial opinion, my initial thought is, and I don't watch enough because I don't have cable. I will be watching more regularly once Raw is on Netflix. But I harken back to the days where, I would tune into prime time or I would watch Superstars, and, Jesse and Vince and Bruno were the team. And it wasn't, a temporary thing, that was the team. And kind of the same with Bobby Heenan and Gorilla Monsoon, and even back during the Attitude Era when it was Jim Ross and Jerry the King Lawler. So I think changing up things just for the sake of change is not necessarily a good thing. I understand the Pat McAfee element, and I wonder if we're in a different time now. It's a different era of consuming wrestling. It's a different era of producing wrestling. So I guess I get the fact that they maybe want to cash in on that crossover and be able to then have wrestlers go on to the Pat McAfee show and do those kinds of things. And I think now more than ever, WWE has crossed into that pop culture mainstream media, if you will, as far as the attention that they're getting. And we see the championship belts at football games and baseball games and college games and the woos and all, those kinds of things. So I think that it helps when you have guys like Pat McAfee and Joe Testator who are from the mainstream, who have come to the WWE, and it's become more, I think wrestling fans become more accepting of it too. I wasn't sure about Pat McAfee in the beginning, but I do think he's a little over the top for me. but I'm a 51-year-old man and I'm not the key demo, and I get that. So, but yeah, I think that having that consistency works better, but I also understand why bringing him back into the fold. I wouldn't like to see it change all the time, but if they started off with a 3-man team and then Pat leaves and they keep it that 2-man team and then Pat comes back into that spot,
Yep.
I think that would be a better transition personally. But I also am not a big fan of the 3-man team. So, and that's something else that we can dig into here too. But what are your thoughts on the changes and then the consistency of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just made a good point. If if Pat left and you still had the core team there, I think that would work better. But and that's kind of what they kind of did when Corey Graves and Michael Cole were calling, the show, which I guess they're now doing. Will be doing SmackDown again together, and then Pat would come in, and Pat and Corey kind of had that love-hate relationship with one another to go. But yeah, I think just changing for the sake of changing. And, was it earlier this year that they had Kevin Patrick, or was
Yeah,
that last year? That
I think
and
earlier this year. Yeah.
earlier this year, and yeah, you bring guys in that don't have the wrestling background, and some of them take to it, some of them don't. And I didn't think Kevin was that bad, but in all honesty, I have felt WWE announcing has been bad since probably the early 2000s, and I tune it out with my selective hearing, so I don't even pay attention to a lot of the commentary. So I don't think he was a bad. I do think Pat McAfee, like you said, he could be over the top, but at least he had enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And I did not get to see the episode of Raw this past week, so I don't know how Joe is. And comments I've read online is that he's much more subdued than Pat. So
yeah,
I'll reserve judgment until I hear him for myself. But let's see. Again, many topics here to touch on.
yeah.
I think when you need a good commentating team, and again, growing up, like you said, we had Gorilla and Jesse and Gorilla and Bobby Heenan, and I guess what I just said with Corey Graves and Pat McAfee is that love-hate relationship. Like, Heenan or Ventura or Jesse would say something and Gorilla would be like, as your shirt says, will you stop? It was like a little over the top because they were the heel and all that. So I guess I'll throw it back to you with the question is, do we need a face and heel commentator, or is that passe at this time?
I think in this day and age, it may be a little passe. I think that the chemistry is what matters. And I think you talk about the key players here, and I think it's Ventura and Bobby Heenan. You put them with anyone else and it works. Jesse and Vince, Jesse and Gorilla, Jesse and Tony Schiavone. Same thing with Bobby Heenan when he jumped to WCW. I thought Bobby and Tony Schiavone were a great team. Bobby and Vince briefly did some commentary together. Bobby and Gorilla to me is the all-time greatest. So those guys could do it with anyone. And that's the color commentary part of it. They're adding that, I went back today as I was scrolling through TikTok, somebody had posted the gimmick battle royal where Bobby Heenan and Gorilla Mean Gene came back and did commentary for it. And Heenan hadn't missed a beat. So I just think that there are certain guys that are just naturals for this and do a much better job with it. But that chemistry to me is everything. And obviously Joe Tessitore is a professional broadcaster. I did hear some of the stuff that he was doing. He sounds great, but I'm like you, I'm going to reserve judgment and see how he and Wade Barrett work together. And I wonder, here's something that I've, that I'm thinking about it, do they audition or do they put commentary teams? Did they back in the day put guys together to see how they would work out? Superstar Billy Graham, look how great he was on the mic. How many wrestlers since him, Hulk Hogan, Jesse Ventura, Dusty Rhodes to an extent, they patterned their promos and their skills and their look after Superstar Billy Graham. But you go back and listen to him do commentary.
Wait. Dusty Rhodes patterned his look after Superstar Billy Graham.
I didn't. I promo on Dusty. But you know, go back and watch SummerSlam '88.
Yeah,
It's horrific, you know, and Superstar Billy Graham, may he rest in peace, but he was not a good
did
commentator.
he die?
Yeah, last year.
Oh, I missed that. I know he's been in bad health, but I don't
Yeah,
remember him dying.
go
So
back. It's in the archives. But yeah, so he was one.
yeah.
Arn Anderson, great on the mic when he did commentary, and again, I think sometimes Ted DiBiase is another example. These guys are great, and then they get thrown into these situations. So that's where I wonder sometimes,
Mhm.
is there an audition process, or do they just throw some of these guys out there to see, we're going to sink or swim and see how things go. But I think the chemistry, it's like any great team. You have to have, whether you're watching your local news or,
Mhm.
a tag team in wrestling, a commentary team on the NFL or Major League, whatever it is. I think if they're not compatible or there's not at least some chemistry there, they don't have to be best buddies. But I
Well,
think,
yeah, I think it's like improv. You have to have
yeah,
guys that are willing to play along.
hmm
And when Gorilla would say, will you stop? He wasn't saying it to be stop what you're doing. Stop talking
yeah,
the way you are. Let's focus on it. It was the gimmick. It was the
yeah,
character of being exasperated with the commentator. The
yeah,
the guy. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, and also that's why Jr. and Jerry Lawler worked well because it's kind of like I guess you know in Hollywood terms, you have Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, you have Laurel and Hardy, you need the straight man and the comedic foil or
yeah,
the comedic sidekick, but you both can't be the comedic factor because there has to be a grounding level, and you can't both be serious at all times.
right.
And I think as you were talking about Billy Graham being doing commentary, and I was thinking about, Lord Alfred Hayes. If you go back and watch like the old
Oh
house
God,
shows commentary, Alfred
yeah.
Hayes, Ernie Ladd, um,
Duke
all these
or
guys that,
Pete Doherty, the
yeah,
Duke of
the
Dorchester. Yeah,
yeah, all these guys who again didn't, I would say, didn't have the personality for commentary. They, um, especially for WWF commentary. So,
yeah. And I obviously, growing up, I watched a lot more of WWE, WWF than I did anything else, and so those memories are the fondest for me. But there were great teams, Tony Schiavone and
David Crockett.
David Crockett. They were both quote unquote baby faces, but you had Tony, who was a little more subdued in his approach, and then David Crockett, who was over the top and very boisterous and whatnot with it. Jim Ross and Michael Hayes back in the old UWF days. There are a lot of great teams, and even today, and this is going to be my nitpick of AEW's commentary is sometimes they have 4, 5, 6 guys out there, and to me, again, I think the 3-man team is a little over the top,
Mhm.
but I think with you know you get more than 3, it's a cluster F in my opinion. So, but I think Tony Schiavone reinvented himself. He's back, and I think he does a great job. Um, Excalibur, Taz, I like all those guys. I think that they all do a good job, and I think that having that wrestling experience helps. But I also like kind of the flavor of guys who don't have experience in the business coming in and showing what they can do, because I think again it adds a little bit more of the quote unquote realism that you're looking for
Mhm.
with a professional broadcaster in Joe Testator versus maybe someone that's a little rougher around the edges and coming in there like a Jesse Ventura. But look how he developed and became that voice for the
Mhm.
WWE. Vince McMahon, he was a lot of people criticized his commentary and he didn't know moves or his play by play and whatever it
Mhm.
was with him. but I think he goes down as he was the voice of Raw for many, many years and of Superstars. And Eric Bischoff kind of borrowed that formula when he started Nitro. He was the one making the decisions. He was the one on the desk,
Mhm.
because who better to kind of put over the product and know where the story is going than the two guys that are writing the story. So, I think that in those regards, I liked that as well. I didn't like the fact that Vince McMahon allegedly overproduced and was in the ears of the commentary teams, because I can't imagine having someone barking at you the whole time you're out there trying to tell the stories. Unless you're majorly screwing up, let them
Mhm.
go and let them talk.
Yeah. Well, I think, when you brought up Shivani and David Crockett, made me think back to WCW and JCP.
Yeah,
And I think I mean, especially now, this is one of the major differences between WWE and AEW. And we talked earlier about sports entertainment versus a wrestling company. I think WWE is more of the storytelling. So you need a good storyteller on commentary. You need someone who can put over the nuances of story, which to me can be a little too much at times, because it's, I think WWE commentators hammer, and this has gotten better since Vince has left and Triple H has come in and
mhm.
allegedly is not overproducing, like you said. But, to me, WWE commentating was always about the keywords and hitting, the, WWE universe and,
Yeah,
just trying to get, and I mean, I understand it, because you're trying to get that drilled into people's brains. So that's what they
sure.
think about when they think about your company. Whereas AEW, I feel, is more of a sports presentation, and it's more, don't necessarily want to say legitimizing it, but it's calling it like a football game or a baseball game, where, and that's where, having Excalibur, having Chris Jericho out there to be that ex wrestler who can tell you why a wrestler is doing something, because how it leads into, a finisher or hurting the opponent. And then you have Excalibur trying to, just tell the narrative itself and keep the story going. And I think that is a major, component with commentary as well, is which type of commentating team do you want to be? And I've watched a lot of indie wrestling, which doesn't know what it's trying to be. And so it tries to be both
Yeah.
at the same time and at different times. And it just doesn't work, because you need, and, go back to the Chikara commentary, where you had the rotating desk of wrestlers coming out and doing commentary. And it was kind of the same thing, where they could explain what was going on, but Chikara, being Chikara, had to be over the top and selling,
Yeah.
why there are ants fighting demons in the ring. So,
Well, and that you brought up a great transition point here too, because pre-COVID Stride, we didn't record the shows. And then once COVID hit and we were doing those shows without fans and then putting it out on YouTube so we could kind of still have a presence and be out there, because of the restrictions, because, literally with Stride, I was shooting these matches on my phone and just doing the commentary, for standing behind the phone live on there, and then putting it out there onto YouTube. So I was a one-man show. And I know that I don't know all the moves. I don't know everything that's going on. And so I also think that a one man, especially in my case, a one man commentary team is not ideal. But in the situation that we were in, we did what we had to do. ECW had that model for years with Joey Styles, but Joey Styles made it work. So do you think less is more, or do you like having multiple people so that they can, again, that chemistry and bouncing off of each other? Or does it, I think, again, it depends on the person and making a one person booth work.
yeah, I agree with you that Joey Styles made it work, and maybe because he's the only one to really try, to get the national attention doing so.
Yeah.
So I don't know if anybody else could do it. Like, I mean, I think Excalibur is a really good, commentator, and I'm really impressed that he has kept the mask on, as commentator of AEW. That they didn't make him take the mask off and be whoever he is under the mask. Like,
Yeah.
they kept that identity, which has nothing to do with the compensation, just tidbit them thrown
No,
out there.
but I
But
do like that. I like that, because I do think that sometimes you brand, JR with the uh cowboy hat. You
yeah,
brand your commentary team as well, and I think that that's an important element. So
yeah,
I agree with you. Kudos to AEW and Excalibur for
yeah,
keeping that element consistent over the last 5 or 6 years.
yeah. And I know Excalibur did a lot of PWG commentating, but I don't know if he ever did it by himself. And I don't know if he would be a good single voice. Like if that, would you want to listen to 2 hours of just Excalibur?
Yeah.
I don't know. And I think without trying it and seeing how it goes, I don't know if we can honestly say one is good enough or you definitely need two voices. Because I mean, there are times Joey Styles could have used somebody, and I know in the later years they did bring in Joel Gertner, and then Don Callis showed up in the later days of ECW when they were on TNN. Um, but yeah, I mean, I definitely think a two-person team is better so you can bounce stories off, and so that again, as much as we said, a heel and face dynamic maybe passe, it does at times help
Hmm.
if so that you have a grounding for it, so that if one person is just being too, you know, like Vince was with Hulk Hogan, where it's just like, oh my gosh, Hulk Hogan's the greatest, or Jesse Ventura being like, oh my gosh, Hulk Hogan is the terrible,
Yeah.
person and whatnot. You needed someone to balance that out.
Well, and and I also think that in 2024, we're that Netflix generation where the instant gratification, where if we don't like something after 8 seconds, we're going to change the channel, we're going to do this, we're going to do that.
Mhm.
That's where I think the solo commentary is hindered because, like you said, we don't want to listen to the same voice for 2 hours. At least when we have a 2 or 3 man team, we're getting other opinions. We're getting, and it's not, maybe not that 8 second change, but at least we're getting something different throughout the course of the 2, 3, 4, 12-hour pay-per-view
Mhm.
in AEW's case sometimes. But we're getting those different opinions and voices and stuff. So what do you think about guest commentators where they come in and they bring in someone in? Um, I always thought that the role of the commentator was first and foremost to get the talent over in the ring. And sometimes that gets just taken away from. And like you said, back in the day with WWE, there'd be other side things going on where
Mhm.
sometimes there'd be a match and they don't mention the match one time. They're talking about what happened earlier or what's happening later, or go to Twitter or do this or do that. And so sometimes I think that hurts as well. I think that the commentating team
Yeah.
needs to be focused on the task at hand, and that is getting over the talent in the ring.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's one of WCW's biggest flaws was what you were seeing didn't matter until the end of Nitro when the NWO was going to be out there, because that's all we talked about
Hmm.
during the show is what's the end. It's the Poochie syndrome. It's
Yeah.
whenever the NWO wasn't on screen, you talked about what the NWO was doing,
Hmm.
and um, to the detriment of a lot of their undercard.
Yeah.
And um, I think again, a guest commentator can be if can be used efficiently, but I think it goes back to what we were saying about chemistry and just there are some people that are good, you know, good commentators, and some that are not.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of recent example. I mean, I think there's a recent episode of SmackDown or Raw where I think Austin Theory and Grayson Waller were out there, and it was what we were just saying. Like it wasn't about what was in the ring; it was about them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think it kind of gets murky and the waters get muddled. And
right.
WrestleMania 2 is a prime example of that, where you're doing the broadcast from 3 different locations, so you're going to obviously need 3 different commentary teams. With today with technology, you probably could have pulled that off with a 2 person team covering all 3 locations. But back then we put Elvira, uh, Susan St. James, and oh God, I can't think of her name. The blonde
Kathy
from
Lee Crosby.
Kathy Lee Crosby. Thank you. They were celebrities and bringing them in and trying to do that appeal, adding them to the wrestler, experience teams of, Lord Alfred Hayes again.
Mhm.
Loved Lord Alfred Hayes, but he wasn't the best.
He was
Mean
good on
Gene,
TNT.
what's that?
He was
Oh
good
yeah,
on T. He was good as the Ed McMahon
yeah. And
character.
that's the interesting thing too is there are unique cases. Jesse Ventura, Bobby Heenan instantly come to mind where they're those utility players where you could put them in any situation and they're going to shine. They're going to excel. Uh, Mean Gene, great behind the scene, backstage in the ring, interviewing guys. On commentary, though, I didn't think he was that good, and that maybe and I don't think that's a controversial opinion. I think that other people have said that as well. So I'm not you know doing anything nefarious with that comment, but you know, again, other guys that were on the promos and doing things versus then and I do kind of like the opportunities that are being created when we do the pre-shows. And I know sometimes they get ridiculously long, but you have that 4 or 5, 6 person panel where they're adding their experiences, they're adding their flavor to it. I think that helps both AEW and WWE. I like those concepts and what they do with those, providing those extra opportunities for those who have been involved with the business to kind of stay an active part of it too. And I know that's kind of a different element of commentary, but
Yeah.
again, it's an important part of the show, kind of setting the table, if you will, before we get to it. And WWE, more noticeably than AEW, has brought in, outside talents to do those kinds of things too. And I think so far it has worked. And not to be overly critical of what they're doing when they bring in, I think in some cases people who are either for their celebrity or because of how they look versus maybe what they know about professional wrestling.
Yeah, I got nothing to add to that. But I'll try. No, I think the pre-show, and I'm trying to, I can't think offhand when pre-shows really started
Yeah,
becoming a thing.
I think
I
more
don't
with
know,
with the birth of the network,
network
probably. I
maybe.
think,
Okay, that makes sense.
but I don't know. I'm like you. I don't
I mean, it's
remember.
just part of the show now. It's like the
Yeah,
post scrum. I like. Well,
yeah,
we'll talk on the post scrums here in a second, but the pre shows, yeah, I do think you don't need a 2 hour pre show,
mm,
even for WrestleMania or SummerSlam. Like it's just like the Super Bowl doesn't need 10 hours of pre show before the game,
right, right.
which is what I compare a lot of the pre shows to. It's like, yeah, it's fine to try to hype up the matches, sell the show to the late audience that may not be um, wanting to watch. Although, since the shows are on YouTube, like if you're not familiar with the fact the show's on anyway, you're probably not watching the pre-show either. It's not like you can turn on, CBS or NBC and see it. Um, but I do think that the pre-show is better than what we used to get back in the day, where it was like a half hour just package, a half hour taped
Right.
promo event.
Yeah.
So that is good. Real quick, the post scrums are the worst, most pointless things going on in wrestling right now. For every CM Punk tirade or timeless Tony Storm promo that tells a story, they're just way. I was surprised apparently last night, or the one after All Out, was only 45 minutes long, which is much better than like when they would go 2 hours or so. But
Oh, wow.
um, yeah, and and I think part of it is this aspect of wrestling being legitimate versus being a show.
Yeah.
And so when you get questions that are trying to be like, oh, you did this in a match, and what are you going to do next? And it's like, well, what does the story dictate? It's not like,
Yeah.
it's like if Tom Cruise goes on, the Tonight Show, and then you say, okay, what's next for Ethan Hunt in the Mission Impossible series? It's
Yeah.
like, so
Well, it'd be like going to watch a play on Broadway and then
yeah,
sitting there afterward and listening to the actors. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Wrestling is such a unique industry in that they try to borrow from all of those things, and then
mm-hmm.
when you try to insert those into other situations, it's like, well, this doesn't make any sense. So yeah,
the
I agree. I have very rarely, I think other than Survivor Series when Punk came back, because I was curious
Mm.
to see, are they going to bring him out and how's that going to look? I don't think I have watched a scrum in its entirety. I did like, back in the day, and probably the most notable one, and this was even before they were calling them scrums, was when they did Talking Smack
Mhm.
and Miz and Daniel Bryan, and I still don't know how much of
Mhm.
that was shoot and how much of that was
Work.
part of the act, if you will. But
Mm.
that's probably one of the more notable ones where it got pretty intense, and
Mm.
people still to this day, I still see clips of that pop up every once in a while. So, uh,
And apparently, AEW may be bringing on a show like that with this
oh,
new shockwave that they've
oh, okay,
trademarked. So I don't know. I don't know. That's just speculation right now, but we'll
yeah.
see. And I mean, with having Renee Paquette in the company, it would make sense for to give her something else to do.
Yeah.
But
So as we kind of wind down the commentary talk, anything else, Chad, that you want to throw out there as far as what makes for a good commentary team? Again, I think we agree two, at least two,
hmm,
no more than three makes a good team. And then again, the heel face dynamic is good, but I think even just having guys with differing opinions, because it did get,
yeah,
a little old from time to time when Vince McMahon was praising what the babyface was doing and Jesse was criticizing it. But then when the roles were reversed, they were kind of doing the same thing. Hulk
hmm,
Hogan cheating, raking someone's eyes or hitting someone with
yeah,
a chair. Vince McMahon was like, well, they deserve that versus Jesse, calling it out. But then when we see Macho Man doing the same thing, Jesse was
yeah,
all for it. So, but yeah, I,
just
I think if it's done right, and back in the day, again, we're looking at this with nostalgic glasses
yeah,
on. It felt good, it felt right, and we enjoyed it. So,
yeah. I was just going to say that those commentary tropes are just like politics.
mhm.
And I was just going to say real quick to wind down. One of the biggest not regrets because it's not something I can regret, but disappointments, I guess, in life is that Stride wasn't around when I was still living in Illinois. So you and I didn't get to be that dream commentary team so that we could prove everything that we just said is correct and that you need the personalities because I think we would have been a terrible commentating team. And and also I never got the chance to turn heel on you and beat you up in the ring. So,
Well,
but I know that doesn't work for you, brother. So,
that's right. That's right. I flex that creative control. I have creative control, but I don't use it. So you never used it. So, well, as Chad mentioned, Stride Pro Wrestling, I am going to plug that one more time. November 8th, it's a Friday night. Join us in Crab Orchard at Crab Orchard High School. But it's been a great episode, Chad. Thanks so much for being a part of it. Friends, we want to hear from you. What are your favorite commentary teams? What makes a good wrestling commentator? Let us know in the comments, whether on YouTube at jitterymonkey.com or your favorite podcasting app. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.